Hello, and welcome back to my channel. This is what I hope will be kind of a continuing series about some of the more unusual books that I've come across. So far, it's only been physical books, but I'm thinking maybe occasionally I will do a digital book as well, because I have a lot more of them than I have physical books. And I want to use this as a way to keep myself reading, a way to keep me in good habits. So, what we have here today, our book for this week, is the Anthology of ASEAN Literatures, Epics of the Philippines. By the way, in case you're not aware, this is not a misspelling of Asian. This is the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. This is it's an international organization, sort of akin to the European Union in Southeast Asia. At the time that this book was published, it was an anti-communist bloc. So at the time, it included only these countries: Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, and the Philippines. Now it has expanded and includes let's see, includes these countries here: Cambodia, Laos and Vietnam, as well as this country, Myanmar, or Burma, depending on how you want to refer to it as. This one was published in 1983, and it's part of a series of ASEAN Literatures, or Anthology of ASEAN Literatures, that was put out, selected by teams of scholars from each of the member states to represent their countries and to show the literature that their country has produced. Because in most cases, these countries have not made a huge impact on the international literary scene, or if they have, it's been due to Western writers writing about these countries. For example, I think the most famous book about any of them is probably, uh, well, at least of any of the original members, is probably Eat, Pray, Love, which is about an American woman who goes as a tourist to Bali. Not really a good representation of Indonesia or Southeast Asia as a whole. If you expand it to um, the current member states, including Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, there are a lot of well-known books about, for example, the killing fields of Cambodia or the Vietnam War. But again, these are, maybe they're good representations of recent history, but they're not necessarily good representations of either the history or the literature of the country as a whole. And that's what this series was intended to show. So, what I have here is the only book that I have from this series. Unfortunately, I would love to have more. If anyone knows where I can find others, I would love to know. Please let me know in the comments if anyone is watching this. But this particular one, it's the first of the Filipino volumes. I know that the great Filipino author Jose Rizal was selected for some of the later works in the series, but this one is traditional oral epic poetry from various different cultures within the Philippines. We have 5 epics here. Uh, the first one is, and I apologize for my pronunciation. I don't speak Filipino. I don't speak any of the languages of the local ethnic groups or local tribes within the Philippines. So I'm probably going to get names wrong. I'm sorry about that. But the first of the poems here is Aliguyan, which is an Ifugao epic. The Ifugao are the people of the Highland Cordillera region in central and northern Luzon. And that I think that was probably my favorite of the 4. It tells a story about Aliguyan is the hero of the story. Although I have to say, when we talk about these poems and we say hero, that doesn't necessarily mean he's always in the right. It just means he's the protagonist. He's the sort of viewpoint character, I guess you could say. And it tells the story about him deciding, more or less on a whim, to re-spark his father's rivalry with his old uh, hated enemy from when his father was a child. Now, as far as we're aware, that rivalry has been quashed. There is no rivalry currently ongoing, but Aligion, our hero, decides, yeah, why not? So he goes to his father's rival's village and announces that he wants to start fighting again. And his father's rival is, well, he's retired, basically. He's too old to fight. So the rival's son goes out to meet him. And the son is every bit the equal of Aligion in terms of strength and ability and fighting prowess and all of this. So they fight for literally years. And that's one of the things that I noticed throughout this book is that time is dilated. Everything happens over the course of weeks and months and years. In many cases, if a hero goes to sleep after a long journey and he wakes up you know a year later, and in the meantime, in some cases this is actually commented on. In the meantime, his parents or his wife will say, what is going on? Why is he sleeping so long? But it's just like you know it's just how poetics works in these cultures. So anyway, they fight for a long time. Ultimately, for just as abstract of a reason as he started the fight in the first place, Aligion announces, "All right, I'm done. I'm going to go home." And naturally, the new rival, who has just been fighting for his land for several years, says, "Okay, you can go home, but I'm going to follow you." And he goes home, and the cycle repeats, and they fight for several years outside of Aligion's village. And after several years, the rival, and I'm sorry, the only name I can remember is Aligion at this point, but after several years, the rival says, "Okay, I'm done. I'm going to go home." And Aligion says, "Okay, but I'm going to follow you." And the cycle repeats until ultimately Aligion sees his rival's sister and asks for her hand in marriage. And the rival agrees to this and asks for Aligion's sister in marriage as an exchange. And everyone basically lives happily ever after. And we have a big sort of shared wedding scene, or actually two wedding scenes, one in the rival village and one in Aligion's village. And peace is restored and everything goes back to the way it was. And I think that structure is, it's kind of something that seems a little bit strange to a Western reader, because most of the time we are kind of expecting uh, to root for one side or the other, and there's really no reason to support Aligion's side here. There is no casus belli. There's no reason for going to war, other than he just gets it in his head. Okay, my father used to have a rival. The rival's still around. Let's go have a fight. and and that's it. And I think that's really interesting because this kind of harkens back to an older style in Western literature. If you think about, for example, the Iliad, uh, if you really read the Iliad, we tend to side with Achilles. We tend to side with the Greeks, but that's really only because we're told the story from their point of view. Um, there's nothing in the text that says that the Greeks are right, or that the Trojans are right, or or anything like that. And you can easily read it and think that the Greeks are horrible monsters for coming and destroying the city over one woman who, at this point, has integrated herself into Trojan society, had several children, and seems quite happy in her marriage. So it's a little bit it's a little bit of a strange sort of acknowledgement that war is complicated and there's rarely a clear good side and bad side. And I do think that that's really interesting. one thing I want to mention about this book in general is that, um, and I guess you could also say about sort of collections of oral folklore or oral epics in general, not just this book, the tendency is to compare them, as I just did, to more well-known epic poetry like the Odyssey, the Iliad, Beowulf, the Indian epics, the Mahabharata or Ramayana, um, the Persian epic, the Shahnameh, things like this. And you have to remember that although those epics had their although those epics had their origins in in oral literature like this, they were at one point written down by people who, whether the traditional identities of their authors is known or not, whether Homer was a real person or not, we can all agree that whoever wrote down the Iliad was a great poet. And mostly the people who are translating these books into the modern languages that we usually read them in. Of course, you know, if you can, I'm sure you should read it in the original Greek. But mostly those translators are trying to render it as literature, as poetry. And that's not necessarily the case for collections of more recent oral epic literature like this one, because in most cases, the people translating these types of books are more interested in textual accuracy, anthropological value, that kind of thing. And anthropology is not the same as poetry. So, although I'm sure these guys did a great job, you're not going to read this and think, oh, wow, this is a second Homer. Because because the people reciting these are not necessarily the best reciters in all of history and their culture, and also because the people translating them into English or into modern Filipino or into Spanish or into French or whatever language you're reading it in, um, are not necessarily interested in making the best poetry so much as in being accurate to the text. So keep that in mind as you're reading, and I think you'll get more out of it. Uh, so as I said, we started off with Alighion, then we moved on to Lamang. Lamang is a really interesting one because this is an Ilocano epic, and the Ilocanos live on the northwest coast of Luzon, and at the time the epic was at the time the epic was formulated, I should say, they had already been Christianized. So, unlike any of the other texts in this book, which are all animist animist texts that involve the local pre-Christian, pre-Muslim Malay, well, not Malay, but Austronesian, I should say, religions. This one is definitely Christian. And what's interesting, though, is that it does pull from those pre-Christian traditions as well. So you get things like comparisons between the Christian God and the animist spirits or deities that preceded it. And in some cases, it seems like the reciter is a little bit ambivalent on whether or not those pre-Christian spiritual beings actually exist, which is, needless to say, quite interesting because it does go a long way to show that just because a culture converts to a monotheistic religion, that does not mean that their old traditions completely disappear. So anyway, this is followed up by Labadongong, which is oh, I forgot the name. Okay, so Labadongong is a Visayan epic. It's from the island of Pasay in the Visayas, which is kind of in the center of the Philippines, between the main northern island Luzon and the main southern island Mindanao. And it's it didn't really stick with me quite as much as the other two, but it is definitely interesting. There's a lot of um, I feel like there's a lot more repetition in this one, but again, it is just like the first one. It's a war epic, and it's a war epic in which the hero is not necessarily what we in the modern world would refer to as a hero, and but it is that aspect of things that I think is interesting. I want to move on because I don't want to make this too long of a video, and I really want to talk about the way that the next poem is structured. So the last two poems are from the island of Mindanao. Mindanao is in the south. Um, it's in the news recently because the Moro population, which is the Philippine Muslims, have been engaged in a war that, depending on your perspective, is either a terrorist or a freedom fighter, because, you know, that's always from your point of view, depends on what you're thinking. Um, but these are pre-Christian and pre-Muslim stories or poems, and in many cases, the ethnic groups that are involved in these are still to this day pre-Christian, or sorry, not pre-Christian, but animist. They've kind of held on to their traditional beliefs by virtue of the isolation of the places that they live up in the mountains in the center of the island. So anyway, we have the Agu epic, which is a Manobo epic, and this one is interesting to me more for its poetic structures because in the course of the 156 pages of this epic, almost every line is repeated. Not exactly, but in terms of meaning. There's a poetic tradition apparently in this culture where the of paired lines using synonyms of basically every word. So let me give you an example of what I mean. Okay. Concerning the partitioned room, regarding the divided chamber, built on the eastern section, erected in that direction, the walling made of glass, the paneling made of silver, built on the western portion, construction in that location, painted indeed is the wall, coated surely is the panel, 10 times the painting was done, 9 times coated and recoated. Um, let's see. When the posts were planted, when the posts were erected, they only stopped digging, they only stopped excavating, when they reached, when they touched, the forehead of Inagne, the head of Intumbagol, proof of the strong foundation, evidence of the secure base. It prevents, it keeps, in case of a great earthquake, should a strong tremor occur, the house from falling apart, the house from crumbling. So you can see it's not exactly the same, but each set of two lines is, you know, it they have the same meaning. So, like I said, this is 156 pages of this. You could easily make this half as long as it is, but it would kind of lose the magic, you know? It would lose what makes it distinct, because this one really did stand out from the other four texts in this volume. And I'm really glad that the translator chose to keep that. And I have to say that this is a decision that might not have been made by someone who was looking for literary value instead of textual accuracy that an anthropologist might be looking for. So in this case, I'm really glad that they kept it like this. Um, the final one, or the final epic here, is Sandayo, which is a Subanon epic from the Zamboanga provinces of southwestern Mindanao. And this is a kind of birth to life story of a hero. And what really makes this one interesting to me is not so much the hero himself as the secondary characters, in particular, his cousin. Um, his cousin is a woman, and she is just as much of a warrior, just as much of a heroine as anyone else in the story. Sandayo himself goes to war, and there's talk about, you know, slaying magical beasts and, um, you know, fighting hundreds and thousands of enemies at any given time. But at the same time, his cousin, who is, oh, what's her name? Uh, let's see. I'm sorry. Ah, Bolak Sonde. Yeah, his cousin Bolak Sonde. She does exactly the same thing. At one point, Sandayo dies, and Bolak Sonde's um, takes it upon herself to go into the underworld to fetch him back, and she faces all kinds of troubles and all kinds of monsters and things like that in her quest to fetch him back, which she takes on with her dagger, and she explicitly says, this is my dagger, and I will use it to rescue you. And later, the same thing happens in reverse. Bolok Sonde dies, and Sandayo has to do the same thing. But it's interesting to me because these two events, even though they are separate, are told almost identically. Only kind of the names are changed, and it kind of shows a respect for female warrior prowess that you might not expect. And it's kind of a refreshing thing, and especially yeah, it's really interesting. She's kind of a Wonder Woman to Sandayo's Superman, if you will. But anyway, like I said, I know that this is not exactly an easy book to find. I found it in a used bookstore in Chiang Mai, Thailand, and I'm really glad I did because this is fascinating reading. And even though, as I said, the poetry may not be up to Beowulf or the Mahabharata or the Iliad, but it is good. The poetry is good. You will want to read more. And I do want to read more. And by the way, this particular volume includes in the back a list of Philippine epics. The book only includes 5, but we have this whole big long list, and I just want to read all of them now. So yeah, I highly recommend it if you can find a copy, and if you know where to find the other books in this series, please let me know. Okay, please let me know. All right. I think I'm gonna have to go. Thank you guys for watching, and see you next time. Okay.